Hey, Jeremy, how are you today?
I'm great, Rochelle. How are you?
I am good. So, Ben and I are so glad to have you join us as our first guest on this first conversation as we kind of launch this community.
I appreciate you having me,
Yeah.
helping me launch my influencer career. This is a big day for me.
Yeah.
Listen, influencer's a thing. It is a thing. Since this is our first conversation, we thought we'd just take a quick second just to introduce ourselves. I am Rochelle, also known as the best decision Ben has ever made in his life.
Absolutely.
I've spent the entirety of my career in the supplier community, both with suppliers and agencies, both in direct and in consulting capacities. Most recently, my current role, I manage the operations for the retail e-commerce analytics team, their arm of One World Sync. So lots of dots to be connected there. It's some fun stuff. Ben, my lovely husband, has spent 35 years on both sides of the decks, actually, both with the supplier and then as a merchant, which I believe, Jeremy, is where you guys met. And then back on the dark side, over here with us on the supplier side.
Yeah. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Jeremy, thanks for joining us today. As Rochelle said, Jeremy has a lot of experience coming up through the merchant world through Walmart Inc., both the Walmart stores, and then where I actually worked with him, both of us were senior merchants at Sam's Club. And then afterwards, after I left and went back into the supplier community, I got a chance to actually call on Jeremy. So I've got to experience his buying expertise from both sides, and honestly, to be truthful, he's one of the best merchants that I've been around, and that's one of the reasons we want to bring him in today. So
Jeremy bought the shakes from you, and I forgot about that. Yes.
Yeah. So Jeremy, and Jeremy, you've moved on to something different now. So what are you doing now?
Yeah, I am with a company called MPG, Market Performance Group. We're a full service brokerage that services both Sam's and Walmart. And I actively manage on a day-to-day basis somewhere between 10 and 15 suppliers, some that have current business and growing business with both Walmart and Sam's Club. And obviously probably around half of them that are new, what we call pioneering brands that are trying to get their footing or their foot in the door with either Walmart or Sam's Club. But joined here February of last year after about a 17-year run with Walmart and Sam's, like you said.
Wow, 17. You're getting old, Jeremy.
I mean, it's about half of 35, Ben. If we're
That's right. Pretty close.
Ish.
So just kind of a setup. So we started going down this path, this concept of getting on shelf, growing on shelf, and then staying on shelf. And there's so many pieces that go into that and so many parts of it. So as we decided to kick off these conversations, we were trying to figure out where to start. And we landed on starting basically at ground zero. Say you're a small to mid-sized supplier, and you haven't had your first appointment with the buyer yet, but you feel like your product belongs on the shelf at Walmart. Where would you start? Well, the first thing you would do is you'd go and you would walk the aisle, walk the run, be in the store. And there are so many things that you can learn as you're doing that. There's a tons of information you can glean if you know what you're looking for. And that's kind of the point of this, our discussion today is what are those things you look for and how can you leverage them? So, Jeremy, what would be one of the first things that you'd look for as you walk the aisle?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of things, right? And I think the first thing as you walk the aisle, it's important to keep in mind that you're probably walking the aisle just as much as a customer as you are a prospective supplier, right? And I think that's a super important aspect or lens to bring to any conversation as well, because, and Ben, you know it too, right? Like, you get very myopic as a buyer, right? You see a lot of stuff in a room, you see a lot of stuff in presentations, you see a lot of data, but the missing piece often is you probably don't spend nearly as much time in your set in the stores as you do seeing it in a meeting room or through a presentation or something like that. So always remember that as you're moving forward with your conversations, what you see as a customer probably is equally as important as what you're going to learn in the aisle as you're going through some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today. But I think the first thing is super easy, right? Like, what starts the run? And I know it seems like a super basic place to start, but I do think that you can learn a lot from just how the merchant is going to market, so to speak. So, for example, is the items or the brands that you see closest to the aisle, is it the biggest? You know, for instance, you know, you and Rochelle and I had the opportunity to walk the Walmart snack aisle or cookie aisle the other day, and there's a huge Oreo brand block right at the beginning of that aisle, right? And so what you can learn from that is the merchant's not necessarily trying to drag you down the aisle, right? Because Oreo is one of those signpost brands. When you see that as you're walking around the racetrack or action alley, however you want to say it, that main aisle, that brand is going to say, oh, look, here's the cookie aisle, right? And so instead of, there are other merchants, right, conversely, that may have put Oreo in the center of that aisle, knowing that it's a destination that people are going to be looking for that. How does he or she bring you down that aisle to the center to get the Oreo where he or she has the opportunity to say, oh, look at all these other brands that I have in this assortment too that you might be interested in, right? So I think that's the first thing. Are they trying to pull you in, or is it an established category that has some really great brand recognition that's going to be visible to the consumer as they're shopping the store? I think the other thing that you can think about there is space allocation, right? So holding power at shelf is a very big deal. We can only sell the stuff that is on the shelf and available for sale, right? And so going back to the example of the Oreos, so to speak, you could tell in that set, there were multiple facings of the exact same, we'll just call it the original Oreo, right? There was probably 4 or 5 different facings of that because that's how many Oreos they're selling, right? So you can get some directional learnings or information from just the amount of space inside even the brands that are leading the aisle as to what's working, what's not. And again, all of this is like, we don't have the data to back it up, right? What are our eyes going to tell us? And if you see 4 or 5 facings of the exact same item, there's a pretty good likelihood that that's a pretty high volume item because they're going to pack it out because the associates in the store don't have the opportunity to reshelve or re-merchandise that as often as the consumer is buying it, so to speak. So how many facings, what has one facing, what has multiple facings? And then I think inside of that, you can also look at pack size, right? And I know, Rochelle, you're going to talk about this in just a little bit, but are there multiple pack sizes, maybe an entry price point pack size, and then a larger price or a larger pack size that comes with a higher price point, but also probably a better value, again, which probably leads you to, hey, these are probably some of the horses in the category. These are probably some of the volume drivers. If they are asking a supplier or a supplier has come to them and they've made that merchandising decision to say, yeah, I'm going to take the normal everyday Oreo and I'm going to put it in a family value pack, odds are it's probably a pretty good seller, right? And so the other things that you can think about, right? Private brand, especially in the last, 3 or 4 years, has exploded from a growth perspective. And there are some categories where private brand plays a significant role in the category, and there's some areas where private brand doesn't, right? If you go back to the Oreo example, not a lot of great value Oreos hanging out in the cookie aisle because the Oreo consumer is a brand loyal consumer, essentially, is what you can take away from that, right? Whereas conversely, if you look at other areas of the store, say, for instance, OTC, where a lot of my experience recently has been, we tried to put a private brand next to every branded item on the shelf, right? And so when you have a Tylenol sitting there, you're going to have Members Mark acetaminophen sitting right next to it, just so that you, as the merchant, can show your customer, hey, I've got everything that you need. And if you're looking at it for a better value, I've got that for you too, right? So is private brand an important part of the strategy for the merchant? Is something that you can tell again as you start to walk down the aisle? And then I think the other thing is, if private brand does play a role in that category, how big of a role does it play, right? So for instance, I just gave you the OTC example where it's I'm going to put it right next to the like item in the assortment, just to make that connection for the member. As we walked the cookie cracker aisle, it was actually kind of at the middle of the aisle, and it wasn't even necessarily next to the item that it was knocked off of, so to speak, right?
Like
So
two of them, right? I think for that whole, 16
Exactly.
run. Yeah.
Exactly. Very minimal SKU perspective, and it didn't even sit next to Oreo, right? And so from that, you can say, look, private brand is probably not a huge deal to the merchant, right? In fact, as we were walking that aisle, that very much felt like I'm checking the box, right? You have to play in private brands. Okay, here's my 2 private brand cookie SKUs, and I'm going to bury them in the middle of the aisle, and they're never going to sell, right? So I think that, again, that whole brand versus private brands strategy can be learned, again, as you kind of walk down the aisle. Those are some of the.
There's a couple other pieces to that too. Like, it's interesting to see how merchants do they try to go with the same count on their private brand and just have a lower retail, or do they try to have an increased count for the same retail? I always thought that was kind of interesting. And then it's interesting too to watch that price gap on private brand. What's the price gap versus the branded, right? And there is a sweet spot there.
Absolutely. And I think that's the exact same thing with the value pack sizes, right? Like, how do you look at 40 Oreos for X amount of money versus 60 Oreos for hopefully what's less on a per Oreo basis, if we're going to use that as our example, right? So, it was always an interesting decision as you were presented with the private brand strategy. And do you go with the same count size for less dollars? Or do you go with the same dollars with a higher count size? And what was the easiest way to kind of express that value at shelf to the end consumer?
Interestingly, the shelf tag. There's
kind of feeds into our next.
Yeah. So the shelf tag, as we were looking at them, they've changed certainly through the years, and they're a little bit different depending on the category that you're in. But specifically, as we walked the cookie cracker aisle, a couple that really stood out that I thought maybe would be informational just to share were this Nutella item, right? Just to kind of point out the different parts of the shelf tag and what you can find there. It's this yellow one. Has in the top right corner of it that black box with the number 9. That is the shelf location. So if you're looking at the set, at that 4-foot set, each 4-foot set in the section, numerically left to right, top to bottom, 1 through however many items they have in that given set, right? This was in the number 9 place. I think this item was maybe, I don't know, at eye level or ish. Eye level for me right here, I think.
What's the significance of the 9, Rochelle?
So
I think there's a couple of ways, right?
Yeah. So the 9 would tell the associate that's setting the modular kind of how that flows. But more importantly, it tells the store shopper who's fulfilling the OPD order where that item is found. And so it plays a crucial role in availability on the website. That your item has that shelf location number, and that your item is in that shelf location number, right?
Yeah, certainly a big change, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, and only going to be probably a more important part of the strategy.
Yeah.
It's a lot more to it than just the price being on the price tag, right?
Yeah, well, and too, right below that orange box, this item was $3.78 at retail, and it's 82.2 cents per ounce. And that's actually one where I've seen a lot of suppliers trip up over themselves because that's you have to read the fine print, right? This particular one is per ounce. I think we saw one that was per serving, another one that was per each. And that part of the process happens way back in the very beginning of the inception of that item, right? Probably as the supplier's building it with their GDSN provider. And I've seen it the most glaring in the coffee category. If you think about coffee, right, you've got the big bulk bags of ground coffee. Those are per ounce. And so it's, pennies per ounce. And then you look at the pods or the K-cups and it's per unit. So if there's 12 in a box, it's per each 12 of those. And so as a shopper, if price is a consideration for me, and that's maybe one of the deciding factors, and I'm looking at that orange box, that per ounce, per each, per whatever, it's really crucial as a supplier that they get that item set up correctly, so that they show up right at the shelf, right?
Yep. Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost as right, like you can learn a lot from walking the shelf as a consumer, right? And so as you walk down that aisle and you look at some of those price signs, you can absolutely understand who's taking the time to do them right and those who haven't taken the time to do them right. And again, that end result from an impact at consumer level was visible to us last week as we walked the set, right? There were some people that's like, oh, dang, this is $14 per each. Well, you didn't set it up right in 360.
Not really $14 for a cookie? What?
Right. So it just speaks to be intentional when you get to that 360 process and making sure that you're setting those items up correct.
Right. A couple other things just off the shelf tag. Actually, the very first thing I was remiss. The very first thing I look at is that very tiny date right in the center at the bottom that tells us when that shelf tag was printed. If most of the tags in the category were printed on the same date, it's probably when the mod was set, or maybe when the set was relayed to a different section of the store, but usually it's when the mod was set. If there's a rollback tag on that item, which is our next example, that's probably when that rollback started because the associate had to print a new tag, right?
Or they came off rollback. Or when they came off rollback, then you'll see a new tag.
Or then you'll see the new one come out. The other thing that didn't used to be on the tags that is now, and it is really insightful, are the facings and the capacity. So this particular item, this Nutella item, had two facings, so FAC2 and a capacity of 38. So FAC2, CAP 38. So I know how that item is set up in their system and how many years they've given two facings of this item on the modular. So it's a pretty important item, right?
Correct.
And then this other example I have, the tag looks a little different. It's white and it has the orange unit price up in the upper left hand side. And there's a was is. This was the item that I was talking about that was on Rollback. That was $4.88. It's now $4.28. Jeremy, what might I glean from that? Just that kind of that price difference in Rollback.
Yeah, it makes you think about stuff, right? And I think as we walked the set together, pretty much there was a large block of those. This is an Oreo item, a large block of those Oreos that were $4.28. So it looked like they were taking some of the stuff that was in the mod pre-reset and bringing them down to the same line price as what the core assortment was reflected in the reset today. And it was also, I think it was also some of the flavored type stuff, right? And so
Like
just
the lemon.
knowing, like seeing all of the different rotations that Walmart's doing and stuff like that. Maybe it was a previous rotation and they're trying to get through it to bring in the next rotation, something like that. Or they just figured out that, look, when we put in a special Galaxy Dunk Oreo, the customer's not willing to pay an extra, 60 cents just because it's a Galaxy Dunk Oreo, right? They're expecting it to be line price with the rest of the assortment. So there's a couple of different hypotheses that you can throw out there. Some of them are probably more right than others. But again, I think it all leads back to just trying to build those talking points for when you're going into the merchant and how that kind of applies to your items specifically, right? And maybe what you take up from it as a newer emerging supplier trying to get in that set is price points matter, right? And what they're showing you is that $4.88 doesn't resonate nearly as much as that $4.28. And so that's a good nugget to have as you're trying to build your presentation with the item that you're ultimately going to present.
Yeah. Good stuff. Yeah.
Yep. And One of the things I think is interesting when we walk the run, and I've always like to look at is packaging, right? So if you're coming to an item that you're trying to get in, look at similar items, what that packaging look like, because the bar has been set, right? Like the stuff in there sets the bar. Is your packaging as good or better? Are you seeing innovation in packaging, right? Sometimes you see some really cool things. Claims can be really important. I know, Jeremy, especially when you were buying OTC, claims are very important to buy.
Absolutely.
Right? Whether it's a natural, organic, know this, know that, call out on the packaging could be really a big deal.
Super valuable real estate on the front of that package, right? Like that's your opportunity to make or break a sale at point of sale, essentially.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes you'd see suppliers that could make a claim on their packaging just based on their current formulation and just didn't, right?
That's right. So. That's right. And look, there's a delicate balance, right? Like
you can get too much.
You don't want it to look like a NASCAR sitting on the shelf, but like if there's things that you know that are timely or relevant or on trend, you absolutely want to take advantage of that space and make sure that's communicated.
Yeah. Jeremy, sometimes other suppliers' mistakes or them falling down can help create opportunity for a new supplier, 100%. Right? So let's talk a little bit about that, and when you're walking the run, what you can look for in that regard.
Yeah. And I think the easiest way to think about it is what you don't see is equally as important as what you do see, right? Yeah. And we talked about seeing the signpost brands and being able to identify aisles from the racetrack. You can also figure out who's struggling, right? And again, there's a couple of different hypotheses that could go into why something might not be in the shelf. And I think it's pretty fair to say that sometimes it's a Walmart issue, right? Like sometimes it's sitting in the back and they just haven't had a chance to stock the shelves. But I think the other hypothesis that you can throw out there is maybe this is a supplier that's struggling from a capacity or a production perspective. And so, you know, looking again back to what Rochelle shared about the shelf tags, like what is this item? Is this an item that maybe I as a supplier could help out with? And is that maybe an opportunity for an introduction to the merchant? Hey, I was walking a store and I noticed that golden Oreos weren't on the shelf. And, you know, I just happened to make a slightly less golden Oreo. And is that something that could be a help for you right now? Right. And again, just trying to figure out those ways of is there an opportunity? Right. And I think that, you know, there's been news recently, right, about the bridge in Baltimore. And I actually did some research on it this morning, just trying to figure out like how busy is the port in Baltimore. And obviously we saw this, right, for the last 4 years during COVID, there was all kinds of supply constraints based off of ports being closed and facilities being closed and all those kinds of things. And so even just that port in Baltimore, which I think is like the 9th busiest port in the US, that port still does 1 million containers a year, which if you break that down is about 2,500 containers a day that are not being processed into the country from out of the country, right? And all of that has a ripple effect. And again, we saw all of this during COVID where, make it up, there's sugar on one of those boats that's now just sitting out there in the water and unable to dock and unload its product. And that sugar is a raw material in how many thousands and thousands of items that could be on the shelf, right? And so stuff like that, again, it's just one example, but it happens all the time, whether it's trucks, whether it's raw materials, whether it's a port, but there's all kinds of stuff that happens out there that could create an opportunity for you to start a conversation with the merchant based off of walking the aisle and noticing that a product isn't on the shelf. And maybe even a better conversation starter is I've walked the aisle multiple times in the last month and noticed that it hasn't been there, right? So it's clearly a systemic issue that hasn't been resolved. And again, if that's something that you can help to meet the need of the merchant or the consumer, I think most merchants would be open to having that conversation. Yeah.
And once you walk the store and you see that issue, you know, then it might be time to dig in and walk a lot more stores, right? And see, is it a very, you know, contained issue or is it pretty widespread?
You know, one of the things that some of the advice I always gave suppliers when I was teaching retailing, one of the best things I ever did, and I started doing it when I was in category management, was the department manager over here in electronics at 5260 was my best friend. Charlie and I, we were tight, right? So the associates, if it's not a really busy time of the day, the associates can be a huge source of information about all the things, right? Stuff that they can't keep in stock, stuff that they have too much of, what they see a lot of customers asking for. And if you see those things again in multiple stores, then there are things to be garnered there.
Yeah. Great call out.
There's always so many things going on behind the scene with incumbent suppliers and buyers, right? That may create opportunity. And it could be a supply constraints, right? It could be price increases. It could be whatever that create that moment of opportunity for a potential supplier, right? And that happens a lot. So. Yeah, and I mean, a lot of times you'll see buyers bring in a new supplier in an area to put pressure on an incumbent or to put pressure on the big dogs there, and that happens a lot. So.
Or a slap on the hand, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I tell clients all the time that being the new and the emerging and the underdog should be always considered a positive, right? And I think you talked to it, Ben, right? Like I think that thinking back on all the days sitting in the merchant chair, there were always suppliers that you had friction with, and it could be over a lot of different things. And at some point, at least I did historically, I got just tired of dealing with it. Right. So like, what's another widget that I can put in there and try and gain some sales or send a message or whatever that is. Right. And so don't think of it as I'm just a little supplier and a new emerging brand. Think of it as I'm an alternative to perhaps a problem that maybe you don't even know about when you're going in for a meeting. Yeah.
Rochelle and I have talked a lot about when we walked around looking at pricing architecture, right? So pricing architecture is really interesting because you can look at pricing ladder as far as absolute price points and the type of product you're trying to get into, right? So what's that pricing ladder look like on a price per ounce or an absolute price point? And where would your item sit in that matrix, right? And is that where you want it to sit? Where does your item fit in? Where do you want it to land? So that's always important to look at too. And sometimes you have to do a little bit of guesswork with, margins and things like that, but you kind of know what cost you'd probably go with and where would that land you? And is that about an appropriate spot for your item based on how premium or how OPP it is? So, yeah.
I think that conversation has even escalated further in the last year, 18 months, right? Like as consumers, wallets got tighter, absolute price points mattered a lot more, right? I had a merchant tell me that they wouldn't buy an item that was going to retail at $5.28 because they broke the $5 price point.
Yeah.
And what they were seeing on their side is that's just death. Like if you break that critical pricing threshold, members just won't buy it. You might as well charge $15 as compared to $5.28, right? And so I do think you have to be really mindful of the lows and the highs, and there are probably some really valid reasons why the highest price point that you see on the shelf today is the highest price, right? And it's probably somebody tried to go higher and it didn't work out very good.
Yeah, that envelope has probably been pushed at some point, right? I mean, it's over time because suppliers do want to get there. It's interesting to see, there are key price points that a buyer seems to be focused on. Like you said, is it $3 and $6 are kind of the two price points they try to hit, and you got to try to figure out where your item would land in that matrix too. So,
and I think it ties right back to what Rochelle was talking about, right? Eaches and ounces and pers are every bit as part of that equation as well, right? Because if you're half the pack size at the same retail, I don't know if that's going to necessarily fly today either.
Okay, I have one to volley to both of you. So as a supplier, I am in complete control of the cost. I also feel like I'm in control of the retail. As a merchant, how does that sit?
Jeremy, would you like to go first?
I appreciate your thoughts, Rochelle.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times in our head, we start with bless your heart, and hopefully that doesn't come out of our mouths when you're saying that you're in control of the retail. Yeah. Look, well, I can tell you firsthand, Walmart takes that stuff exceedingly serious, right? Retail is always at the discretion of the retailer. And while you can put SRP on a presentation all day long, once you submit that item for consideration, Walmart can do whatever the heck they want with that retail. And there is nothing that you can do about it outside of stop shipping them. And it is serious, right? There are
I have worked with so many suppliers who just get so butt sore because the retail is not whatever they think that it should be, right? And like,
As a buyer, a lot of times you'd have suppliers kind of take that tact of what you should retail it for. I've heard a lot of buyers come back, well, okay, if you want to control the retail, then do I control the cost? Because both supplier and the buyer have one part of that equation, and you got to remember which part's yours and what's not yours, right? So, yeah,
and I think again, there's so many legal ramifications that can come out of those pricing conversations, right? And so I think the best course of action is share the information, right? So like, hey, we're recommending $4.98, right? Yeah. Here's what we're having. Here's what we sell the same thing for in the rest of the market, right? We have the same pack size at a Meijer for $5.48. So Walmart's getting a value, right? And again, all you can do is lead the horse. And at some point in time, they're going to be autonomous for the decision.
I think a lot of it got a lot to do with tone that you take with the buyer as far as SRPs. Say, hey, we suggest this, and here's why. Here's the rationale behind it. And I think buyers are pretty receptive to that. I think what they're not receptive to is, when you're very prescriptive of this will be the retail, and that doesn't seem.
Well, I think and to Jeremy's point, like, what is your value proposition? Which you talked about, like, because Walmart wants to be the very best, right? Yeah. And so how does that help them shake out there?
Well, and I think it's on both sides, right? Let's be honest. Walmart is a for-profit retailer, right? So if you present an item to them that allows them to Ben's point, to make probably close to the margin that they would expect to make from the category, while at the same time still being able to show that value to the consumer, I don't think you're going to get a ton of pushback, right? Like, buyers still have objectives that they have to meet from a sales and profit perspective, no different than a supplier has from a sales perspective too.
Yeah. But sometimes you'll see too is when you start thinking about the margin structure for a retailer, if you're coming in as a new item, and chances are you're probably going to come in on the fringe, right? And so usually buyers will push the margins on those items a little bit higher.
Correct.
Right? Whereas if you've got an item that turns a lot of volume, it's a very staple, very core item, you can probably live with a little less margin. So as a new supplier coming in, thinking you're probably going to be on the upper range of that margin range for that category or subcategory. Generally.
And it's a plus in your column, right? Like, oh, well, maybe you're not moving as many units as what the hurdle rate is, but you sure are delivering on the profit aspect of it. So you kind of have to think of it as a combination of those two metrics that are going to be important through the evaluation period.
Well, and then you maybe have some wiggle room to do some stuff with pricing for promotion, right?
Correct.
Possibly so. Well, and that brings me to another point as far as walking the run. Is one thing to look at is like your competitive items that are already there. What is the value you're seeing at Walmart versus grocery? Because chances are your business. This is generally a $2.50 item at grocery for this competitive item, and Walmart's $2.12. And if you can look at enough items like that, you can kind of work out where you think you're probably going to have to land, in terms of value on the shelf, which backs you. It kind of, helps you with your costing and stuff too, because you kind of know where you have to be cost-wise to be in that range. So if the general savings or the discount at Walmart is 15% versus grocery on like items, you're probably going to have to land around 50%.
Yeah, it's a great call out. Don't just walk the aisle at Walmart, walk the aisle everywhere.
Yeah. And sometimes you've got syndicated data to look into to be able to tell those things. And sometimes it's going to be you walking the run and making a lot of good notes. So
that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing about that is it's all going to benefit when you go into that meeting with the buyer, right? Like showing that his business or her business, and showing that you've walked the aisle, showing you're a student of the game, so to speak, and that you're not just coming in to throw stuff against the wall to see what sticks. That's gonna gain you points, I would say, in terms of the conversation with the merchant, as opposed to just going in and saying, I got Jeremy's barbecue sauce and I want to sell it for $11 and there's nothing in the aisle that's above $5, right? And so
Yeah.
I think going in and spending that time and doing your homework and being a student is only going to pay dividends down the line.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because most buyers like to talk about their strategy. And
Absolutely.
most of them don't mind answering questions about it. And I
Absolutely.
think if you come in and you say, "Hey, I'm seeing you're doing these things. What's behind that? What's your thinking there?" Most buyers will share that with you. You can get in some really good conversations, and it's a lot better conversation, like you said, Jeremy, if you've proven you've done some work, that you've walked, that you've got some ideas, you've got some questions. So I think that could be a really powerful thing, especially once you make it in that first meeting phase.
100%.
Guys, is there anything we've missed? I know we've talked about a lot of different things. Do you think we've missed anything that was kind of on our list there?
I mean, we could talk for days, right? I'm sitting here thinking like, okay, we need to talk about this. We could talk about what transportation, collect versus prepaid. How many people do you take to the buyer meeting with you? And I think that while we could be here all day doing that those are things that we maybe table for another discussion.
Episode 2. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think if that's it, Jeremy, thank you so much for taking the time today. We just opened the pool, so you'll have to come over and partake of work time next to the pool. And I hope you have a great weekend.
I love it. Thank you guys for having me. This was fun. Always fun to talk about retail and the experiences and seeing it through our eyes with a little bit of background on both sides. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. And if anybody needs to get in contact with any of us, you can go to the LinkedIn, our personal LinkedIns, as well as the information that is provided through Conversations on Retail.
Perfect.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.